Hospital port as pride and dignity. Stop the New World Order. Welcome to Hapanwo TV. Welcome to this, an interview. Now this is, I hope you'll find interesting, because this is an interview with a viewer, actually a regular viewer of mine called Cosmic Claire. Now, to give her proper name, it's Claire Rae Randall, and if you've heard that name before, it's not unlikely actually, because Claire actually doesn't just watch other people's channels, she produces her own content. And she has been interviewed on many channels across the dissident, non-conformist, non-mainstream circles. This is not the first one she's ever been on. And if you Google her name, you'll find loads of other interviews with her. Now, in this particular interview, we're going to discuss something which is completely new. It is her book, her new book, and this is it here. It's called The War on Gender, Postmodernism and Trans Identity. And you've probably actually guessed, I mean, you can pause and read the back cover there, and indeed there's the spine. That's Claire there. You see her image. Oops, where is she? There she is. That's Claire. Oops, my finger's over it. Yeah, that's it, yes. Let's see, there she is. And you can pause and read that. This is a new book that's just come out. It's been published by Arctos Media, which is actually a publisher of books which specialises in dodgy content, shall we say. I don't think I don't think Penguin would pick this up, or Macmillan, I must say. It is actually about, you may probably guess from the title, it's about a subject which, it's actually right here, right now, in the last couple of years, and it's quite recent, I must say. It's probably one of the most controversial subjects it's possible to talk about. So, just to warn you in advance, if this video disappears down the YouTube memory hole, as they can do sometimes, it is, as always, going to be uploaded to all my alt tech platforms. So, if you haven't subbed to me on BitChute, on Rumble, and on Odyssey, why not? Please do go ahead, sub to me there, because it could be the only way you'll watch this video. So, with no further ado, let's bring Claire onto the show. Ladies and gentlemen, listeners to the Hapanwo show on Hapanwo Radio, and if anyone's watching this on video, we are making a video recording too, so hopefully people are watching as well. I'm with Claire Rae Randall. She's back again. Now, Claire is a regular guest. You've heard us before on the show talking about Trump and Brexit and 2016 and all its wonderful works thereof. We're back here to talk about a different subject, and about this book. That's Claire's latest title. I mean, we did discuss Waking the Monkey, which is a previous title of Claire's, which I have reviewed and we discussed. This one is called The War on Gender, Postmodernism and Trans Identity. And there's the cover there. And there's
I'm
the back.
Afraid it's not working out on the. I think you're taking up too much screen on there, Ben. And so
it's fiddling. Oh, right. Okay, I'll do it like that.
That's fine. That's great.
That's better. Yeah, so everyone can see it there. Yeah. This is available from Arctos Media. www.arctos.com, and it's a publisher that specializes in politically incorrect literature. If you look at their other authors and the other titles, you'll know what I mean. I think we need that in this day and age. The cover's very interesting, Claire, because it has these symbols on here, which I think if in thousands of years' time, if a future archaeologist discovers these, they'll wonder what on earth they meant. Because there's obviously the male and female symbol there, but there's lots of others which I can't even begin to comprehend. That there's a sort of there is an explanation. It's a book with a lot of details. It's partly an autobiography, I should say, and it's also, there's science, there's politics, there's philosophy, and all kinds of things in here. It's really, you cover the whole issue. This is the first book I've ever read on the subject of transsexualism, transgenderism, and the various words that you use with it. But it had a long, so how did this come about? Because it's taking you a long time to write this, Claire, hasn't it?
Oh, it has been, yes. And first of all, thank you very much indeed for having me back on Hapanwo Radio. I'm very pleased. It's fantastic, and I'm most grateful for the patience that you've exhibited in waiting for this book of mine, which has taken me something in the region of 7 years. I was just starting to write it when I had the infamous Lana Lockteff interview on Radio 314.
I remember that,
in the autumn of 15, which was just at the time that politics were really starting to hot up towards Brexit, Trump, and all that. So
I remember that interview well. Yeah, I do.
Yeah, and so it's just taken an immensely long time. I've had several. Well, I've had three. I've had two family members and a close friend lost, passed away during that time, which each time has taken up more delays.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so but as Dr. Jason Giorgiani said to me when I was delayed at an earlier point, he said, "Don't worry, Claire, it'll be a better book as a result." And he's absolutely right, because I ended up adding several chapters, rewriting other chapters, and eventually I was thinking about self-publishing in the beginning of 21, and then the post January the 6th censorship happened, and obviously I was really worried about getting shut down after that. So I started looking around for publishers. I approached 3 different publishers first. One politely declined. One sent me an abusive reply. And the other one completely ignored me, even though I wrote to them twice. So eventually I thought, oh, well...
That's how good this book is, yeah.
Well, so then anyway, obviously, Dr. Giugiani, we'd kind of connected because he published Prometheus and Atlas, which obviously you see I reference in the book, in 2015 as well. So I think he had probably just published that shortly before I had the Radio 314 interview. So we'd kind of noticed each other, I suppose you could say, and we had a few brief conversations on, internet messaging services and things like that. So when it came to me approaching him, he knew, roughly, what I was on about, and so he was very kindly said, "Well, let me have a look at the manuscript, and I'll see if I think that it's suitable for a recommendation to Arctos, because I dare say if I'd approached Arctos cold, they might have ignored me like the other publishers. Obviously, having a known recommendation really helps, and I was absolutely knocked out that they offered me a contract to get it out. So well, that was a big load off my mind. And the funny thing is that I've been kind of fretting about how long it's taken to get this book out, and I kept on thinking, it's all going to be over by the time that this gets out. People will have lost interest in the subject. It'll have just become bored with it. But actually, we seem to have hit what I call peak transmania. That's my hashtag, peak transmania.
It's probably a good. It's actually probably a good time for that reason. Yeah, I
think it is actually. So it's kind of like actually perfect timing, because I mean some of the stuff that's coming out now, it's just quite extreme. I mean, there's that chap who's been doing this. What is a woman? Interviews with people on
it's a film. It's become a kind of film, isn't it?
I haven't actually watched it, I have to say, because I sometimes I'll probably have to get round to watching it at some point, but I don't like watching a lot of these things because so many of them, they just end up being abuse. They just say things. They're not interested in actual discussion or debate about the subject. So if someone is just saying that about just going to dismiss me, then there's no point in me having a conversation with them, obviously.
Well, you've had, unfortunately, in distant circles, this is a problem I've noticed from distant circles, and you punch both left and right in this book.
I do.
I must say.
I do.
You take on obviously the trans extremists, but also some of the anti-trans ideas as well, who dismiss you, for example, as being mentally ill.
Yes.
And they say things like, "Oh, come on, be a man, stop pretending to be a woman," things like this, or there's lots of other. I mean, to be honest, I sort of wondered about this for a while. I did sort of think to myself in the past. I thought to myself, well, maybe it is kind of a mental illness that can be treated in other ways with all patients other than life transformation and body transformation. And I was wrong about that, and I think these people are wrong too. But on the other hand, you have people like Ketanji Brown, who actually I think she wants to be on the Supreme Court in the United States, a lady who, when asked what is a woman, said, I don't know. And Keir Starmer was doing the same thing. So this is a good time for the book to come out for that reason.
Yes, I think so. Yeah,
it's just the perfect. You really have. You didn't know how hot the iron was when you struck it, but it turns out it was very. So it's good. Maybe it was a good idea to wait a while before publishing and launching the book.
Well, I was, I always kind of had this idea that really, from a Taoist perspective, I was kind of thinking, well, hopefully Providence will allow this to come out at the most effective time, and I think it's a pretty effective time for it to come out. So yeah,
exactly. I think you mentioned you have mentioned sort of things like synchronicity, because you in this book you do go into some of your earlier topics which you bring up in Waking the Monkey, things like synchronicity and things like that as well. But I think I would encourage everyone on both sides of the debate to read this. So I suspect that the trans extremists won't read it, and you like whoever sent you an abusive reply from the publishers. A lot of them won't. I think people on the distant circles will, which is why I think Arctos. I think this is the attraction that Arctos had for it. People in the distant circles will, and hopefully they'll learn a little bit more, because you learn a lot about Claire. I think you've never spoken about some of these things before, I don't think, from your other published works. You talk about your own past, your own life.
Yeah. In Waking the Monkey, I think there's about 3 or 4 pages buried in deep at about page 250 or something about this. And it kind of explains a lot about the book, but at the same time, I don't go into it at greater length than just one drop, 3 or 4 pages, go into it real full depth. That's it, over, move on. And so the reader can kind of see this background, but I don't like to draw it. I don't like to go on about it all the time, because this is something that the trans activists do, that frankly it bores people to death, I think. And this is why quite recently we have seen, I think, a turn of opinion against trans people and trans rights. I think 10-15 years ago there was a kind of movement to greater acceptance, and that was great. But in the last sort of 7 or 8 years, I would say, I first started really noticing things on social media about 2014 or 2015, which was when a lot of these things started kicking off. There are obviously people with political agendas who decided that was the time. And I want to, the thing is, I have recently started seeing people making posts on social media about reversing the legal acceptance, legal recognition, which has been achieved in England, Britain, UK. It was 2004. But unfortunately, as I go into quite some detail in the book, the 2004 Gender Recognition Act has turned into something of a poisoned chalice, because all the medically reassigned transsexual women that I knew in that time period, who followed the Commons debates and a bit in the Lords as well, such well-known figures as David Lammy and Lord Tebbit.
I'm surprised to hear David Lammy involved in this.
Well,
no surprise there.
He, I think, is as well. I mean, I mentioned this in my Arctos interview the other day, and I simply can't emphasize this enough, that basically you'll have seen how it was that in 2004, when questioned in the House of Commons about what would there be to prevent people who had not been medically transitioned, forcing their way into women's changing rooms and so on and so forth, once they'd got a gender recognition certificate, David Lammy said, well, I don't know what kind of planet you're living on if you think that anybody like that would be granted a gender recognition certificate. And of course, it was actually the case that David Lammy himself was keen to emphasize at the time in 2004 that the UK gender recognition bill actually was groundbreaking. I couldn't find the actual reference, but I'm pretty certain he used that term, in that it was the first gender recognition act in the world to make it not necessary to have had medical reassignment treatment. So there had been, I think it was something like 25 or 26 countries in 2004 had already passed gender recognition acts for transsexual people, such as myself, and I think New Zealand, Australia, Commonwealth countries. But so David Lammy was proudly declaring that he was so proud that the UK Act redefined gender, and in fact this was gone into at a later stage by the legal scholars, and that they were now proud that they were legally detaching gender from sex.
Right, that's a can of worms, isn't it?
It is. And then the following year, or about a year and slightly longer later, there was a very, very influential paper published by Professor Stephen Whittle, who I knew a long time ago when I first tried to transition back in the 70s. And he's been a very kind of active person on the trans scene for this last 45 or 50 years. And the trouble is that, well, when he published this paper, Whittle and Turner, 2006, he explained that they kind of went into a kind of legal obfuscation, basically explaining why it was that actually the whole point of the Gender Recognition Act in 2004 was to redefine these terms, right? So now, as a philosopher, someone who's got a background in academic philosophy, the idea that 18 months after you've passed a new law, you bring out a legal paper explaining why that law completely redefined the meanings of the terms that were being used in the Act. So that, Professor Whittle says, so that having passed the 2004 Gender Recognition Act, which redefines terms of gender and sexuality, he explains, and I think you will have read this in my book where I quote him, he says, so following the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, it is now legally possible to have women with penises and men with vaginas. Now, I'm willing to draw fine lines and make legal exceptions with what some people might call legal fictions or whatever, to kind of smooth over the fact that the universe and gender is something which has a lot of grey areas in it. And
it's natural grey areas.
Natural grey areas, yes. So obviously, intersex is a grey area. Now, I actually quote the researcher who's done more research on gender identity and transsexualism than any other scientist or medical researcher in the last 50 or 60 years, I think even, Dr. Milton Diamond, and I quote several of his papers in my book, and he comes to the conclusion that transsexualism is a form of neurological intersex. Now, this is the guy who's done more research on the subject. He's done separated twin studies and numerous other, bits of research, some of which I quote and some of which were too much to get into the book. So obviously intersex is a grey area. Transsexualism is a grey area. Now, so what we have is with the kind of what I call the postmodern Alinskyite left is they want to exploit this to say, oh, well, grey areas, that means we have 5 million different genders. Now, all these different genders are pretty much just kind of made up on the spur of the moment, as far as
that's what these symbols mean on the cover of the book. Yeah. And it's astonishing, some of them. They're amazing. But you mentioned rules for radicals, in that you actually, this is all in the text that they've written themselves, like you mentioned Saul Alinsky.
So what they want to do is to say that, so this is kind of reverse reasoning. This is a kind of inductive reasoning, which says that, well, because we have a few anomalies, therefore we have to redesign the entire structure of how gender is perceived in the world, even though it's been seen as the way it is since pretty much the dawn of time, earliest recorded history. There have always been men and women and a few anomalies, right?
Yeah.
And so all I'm interested in really is basically trying to establish where we draw the legal boundary. So
that's very important. Yeah, I think this lack of a proper boundary is exactly why Keir Starmer refused to answer the question, and Ketanji Brown, a prospective Supreme Court judge, they just wouldn't say what a woman was. And this whole gender recognition kerfuffle is all about that. And as you explain in the book, it's almost, I mean, we can't prove it's the case, but it fits exactly with what the Alinskyites wanted. They want to knock down and destroy, break down all these social norms and leave chaos behind. And it's out of the chaos they can build order, their own version of order. And they've done this with everything else in society.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to point out the inconsistencies of and the excesses of the Alinskyite left. And I had to restrain myself very severely from using Douglas Murray's analogy, which you're probably familiar with, in his book, The Madness of Crowds. He talks about how the LGBT rights train came into the station, and instead of discharging the passengers on the platform, it carried on straight through the buffers and kept on going to the point where, it's a bit like that train in Back to the Future where it kind of goes over the cliff,
Yeah. That's exactly what it's like. I mean, he's good, Douglas Murray, with things like that, these analogies. But it does seem that way, because I'm old enough to remember when issues such as of gay rights was a real thing. I mean, it was obviously it's been legal now for many decades. You can't actually be arrested for being gay. I mean, the LaBouche Amendment was repealed, things like that. The whole Helen Duncan case is all connected to that, which I've been studying on an completely independent issue. But homosexual couples can now get married. They can adopt children. I mean, I don't think I'm not in favour of that myself, but I don't have a problem with marriage. And they can fall in love and be a couple. I mean, my brother's gay. It's something I'm completely accepted. I don't have a problem with other people's private lives. And now you think that organisations like Stonewall, which have been campaigning for over 50 years for this very thing, would say, okay, mission accomplished.
Yes. Yeah.
But they haven't.
I would hope so.
Yeah, they haven't. They can't put this hot potato down.
Well, it's a bit like something that I think you've probably heard said about the truther movement, is that some people aren't willing to accept that they might win certain points. I mean, I think we hear this, people saying that it's impossible to win, on certain, truther issues. And they say, oh, well, we can never get Brexit. It will never be allowed. And even if we get it, it will be, this, that, and the other. Yeah. And they're always basically looking for a reason to say that everything is bad.
Yeah, and they tend to be the same kind of people who point fingers at other people and say, you're an MI5 agent and things like that.
Yes. Yeah, I think we've encountered one or two like this. I've got to really, face all these different angles on it, and I know that I mean I've been posting a bit on Twitter about this, and it falls off into two very distinct categories. Obviously, there is now the very much the anti-trans movement is definitely picking up speed now. But also, I had several comments from trans people who are saying, "Oh, you're just wanting to stop us getting treatment, or you're just wanting to be a gatekeeper." And all I want is just really for people to have a clearer idea of what this is all about, and obviously one of the very, very troublesome things which is happening at the moment is that this kind of uncontrolled rush for treatment of children. It's frightening.
I had trouble reading that chapter in your book, actually, because it was so upsetting. This is I think that's the darkest part of this whole chaos. Although there are other areas which are slightly less dark. I'll come on to the children in a minute, but I'd like to. There's some areas that are slightly less dark and even quite humorous at times.
Yes.
Although I think it's something you should take seriously. Is that one of the products of this, going back to 2004 and the Act and all these sorts, and this new culture that's emerged and it's been deliberately stirred up, is you get some people, and Kevin Logan tends to interview these kinds of people. This guy on Twitch, who they're trans, and they say they're trans, and some of them are very clearly not what I would describe as trans if I saw them. For example, there's someone I would describe as a woman who says she's a female to male transition person. Looking at her, I wouldn't call her that. I mean, she's very feminine, but she's extremely volatile. She swears a lot. She shouts. She can't really cope with disagreement and things like this. There's another one called Mix Vivian Wolf who says she's an anti-fascist and she's male to female transition. She does look quite feminine, I must say. She has slightly different voice and appearance, but she's another one who is extremely. She's extremely angry. She's extremely agitated. She regularly goes off on rants, and she sounds to me like a very, very unstable person. And you're getting a lot more people like this, including some much more mature people. You mentioned, I mean, it's a famous story. You bring it up in the book. Bruce Jenner, who became Caitlyn Jenner in his mid 60s.
Yes.
After a whole lifetime of appearing not to be that way. And so it seems to me we are falling into a situation where a lot of people, there's a huge proportion of the population now who really don't know what they are.
Yes.
Or where they're going, and you get like these people called, it's a rude word, but I've got to say, you call them gender fuckers.
Yes. Or gender fuck is the action.
Yeah.
The action, yes. Well, because basically, I came across this in the late 2000s when I was fraternizing with the LGBT community between about 2004 to about 2012, and during that period of time, it progressed quite a lot to the point where at first it was just like, oh, great, we've got recognition now, and gay people were like fine about that and everything like that. But then as the decade progressed, we got more and more towards this kind of thing like everybody calling themselves queer, and they're basically doing everything they can to transgress social norms and expectations. This is one of the big words with gender ideology, is transgression.
There's quite a few like that. Jessica Yaniv, this Canadian person.
Yeah, well,
I don't know exactly what pronoun he or she or it uses, but this is someone who seems to enjoy and has become quite famous for being outrageous and very flamboyant and winding people up the wrong way, going into beauty parlors and insisting that her testicles get waxed and things like this.
Yes. I know. Well, I don't think I mentioned Jessica Yaniv in my book.
She's someone I thought of when I was reading that.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, clearly, from my point of view, people like that are really just pulling the collective legs of society. You
Yeah,
know, they might believe themselves. It might be a case of in her mind it was true, but obviously one of the main points that I'm constantly coming back to in the book is that you have to demonstrate what your claims are. You know, you can't just say, well, I hope you enjoyed the Jeremy Clarkson postulate. I don't know what you thought of that.
Yeah, that would be quite a turn up for the books, wouldn't it?
Yes. And of course, you know, so I'll just say for the listener what that is that Alexander was quite amused by this the other night when I was talking to him about it on the Arctos interview. Because so Jeremy, for those of our listeners who are not from the UK, Jeremy Clarkson for many years presented Top Gear, which was a program about cars, and he's a very blokey bloke. I think that people accuse him of being a male chauvinist pig, and he probably wouldn't be in the slightest bothered about that.
Oh, he loves it. He wears it on his sleeve.
Yeah, exactly. And so well, I think we've established the kind of person that Jeremy Clarkson is. I find him quite amusing. I don't have anything against Jeremy Clarkson. He's great. And but if Jeremy Clarkson suddenly at the age of 65 or whatever said, I'm a trans woman, I've just been too shy, not that Jeremy Clarkson is a shy person, but if he said, I've just been too shy to come out, we would all kind of hold our breath and say, okay, Jeremy, what are you going to do about it? So if he just carried on exactly as he is now, we'd probably all say after 5 minutes, we'd say, oh, Jeremy's pulling our leg, isn't he? He's just having a joke about this at the expense of some of the other maybe less transitioned trans people.
It's something he might do, I think, if he suddenly he found himself becoming slightly less famous and he was concerned about
yes
it. You know, it's something he might I think some of the trans trenders, if you call them, will jump on that bandwagon just so people will talk about them. You know, the same way that Lenny Henry is now trying to invent himself. He's trying to reinvent himself as a wokist because he's not funny anymore. And that's a problem. Same with Whoopi Goldberg. You know, they're not fun. They used to be funny. They're not anymore. It's not our fault, but they want to reinvent themselves. Yeah.
Well, I used to be a big fan of Joni Mitchell, you know, but, you know, that was 40 years ago. So, I mean, obviously this is, you know, getting back to the Jeremy Clarkson business, of course. So what I suggest in the book is that if Jeremy Clarkson never did anything to alter his appearance, never had any medical treatment, never presented himself in any different way or any way at all, then we would all say that he was obviously just trolling us. And yet there are people today who, on the basis of what David Lammy and his co-sponsor of the bill, Lynn Jones, said at the time in 2004 that this kind of thing would never happen. Yet there are people who are behaving as the postulated Jeremy Clarkson, claiming to be women, and I'm not even sure, but some of them have probably even got gender recognition certificates, because they say, well, you know, there's one, I won't mention any names because I'll probably get you prosecuted or something like that. But there is one, for instance, who wears a beard and hasn't done anything to change their appearance. And they say, well, I don't think I could ever pass as a woman, so I'm not going to try, and I'm just going to reinvent what it is to be a woman. And I think to myself, this is really embarrassing.
It's quite it's quite sinister, I think.
Yeah, it is. I mean, because there are now tons of people, well, there seem to be anyway. I mean, they're probably not as many as they look like, but they have a high profile of visibility in the media. People who are, well, obviously I can name this because this is a current thing, the Leah Thomas affair, who Leah Thomas is a partially transitioned transgender person who is participating in women's swimming, and obviously swimming is very much reliant on shoulders. And
yes, you need muscle power, and things like that.
And I've actually heard reports that she hasn't, that she actually undresses herself and exposes herself. She's still male-bodied in what counts, and that she's completely unembarrassed about changing in front of the other women in the changing rooms, which is just like bizarre.
It's something bizarre. It's something literally less than a decade ago people would scratch their heads at this, and I mean it's I mean I've heard that, because I follow a lot of the sort of lefty type people as well. I mentioned Kevin Logan and Christy Winters and people like that, and they say no, it's okay. It's the treatment will actually prevent her from having an advantage. However, maybe after a long time, I mean, you yourself, because you've been a woman for so long, possibly someone in your position, yeah, but this is someone, like you say, who's partially transitioned, and according to this act, they could possibly get a certificate without any kind of medical treatment at all. And
yes,
it's just not. This is, as Martina Navratilova points out, she mentioned Serena Williams, who played her cousin at tennis. Now her male cousin is he's an amateur, and he beat her in straight sets. It's because he's a man.
Yeah.
And this is why women's sports is so carefully segregated, so women can compete against each other in their own, on their own terms. I mean, it's only for like sports which involve physical strength. I mean, women and men compete against each other in sports which don't. For example, equestrian sports, women and men compete against each other. And because the horse is doing all the work, sometimes, very often, the women win. But really, this is a question that's got to be asked. If this person, Leah Thomas, believes she's a woman, then she doesn't really. If she's got the body of a man, including genitalia, then why should we believe her? Why should she be allowed to go up against women?
Exactly. This is like a case of the Jeremy Clarkson postulate. I mean, as far as taking hormones or male hormone suppressants, the claim that taking it for a year will remove any advantage is just simply not true.
No,
it's just simply not true. I mean, I've been transitioned now for more than half of my life, and I have a friend who's a care worker, and she's about 12 years younger than me, and I have problems with chronic fatigue, and she's got much better stamina than me, but when it comes to actual physical lifting of objects, I can just pick things up that she can't. And I'm not nowhere near as strong as I might have been, but there's a certain skeletal-muscular advantage that once you've got past 20 or some early 20s, it's just never going to go away.
So even after all these years of complete transition, you still have an advantage.
Yeah.
That's it. That's quite important for a sporting perspective. I think that's a very important issue. And Martina Navratilova, who was a famous female tennis player long ago, is right to bring up these concerns.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And
carry on, sorry.
Go on. No,
I was going to say the response, though, to these concerns, and I mean, Sargon of Akkad actually is one of the best commentators on this. Although I think he's come down too much on the turf side over this, and I've got an issue with that. But that's another story. But he's really he covers like the response, the backlash when people like Navratilova and speak out about this, and they are treated. They are treated the way, like, for example, the word racist is still used. They're kind of put in the same category as racist, homophobe, etc. And there's this word transphobe or transmisogynist and things like this. It's applied to everyone. It's applied even to yourself, who's actually a trans woman yourself. So there doesn't seem to be any real outcry for discussion on this. And if judges and senior statesmen like Keir Starmer won't even discuss it, what are we going to do?
Well, obviously, there are two possible choices here, as far as I see it. One is that the Alinskyite left wins, that all distinctions, all legal boundaries are removed, so that obviously you don't need gender recognition certificates or processes or anything like that. But far more importantly, you would have obviously women's spaces would no longer be protected as women's spaces. And the alternative is that we have a thorough, wide-ranging discussion about this, covering all of the topics that I've raised in my book and others, if people can think of them, and come to some kind of decision about where we draw the line between the legal definitions of men and women. And there are problems with that, but that's why we need to talk about it, because while I do not like or agree with what's her name, that woman, her name's falling out of my head now.
What does she do?
The one who wrote those books in the early 90s, that Bodies That Matter and things. I mentioned her several times in the book.
Right. I know you mean. I can't remember her name. Yeah.
Anyway, it'll come to Judith Butler.
Yeah.
Judith Butler. Yeah. So anyway, I think the one useful thing that she did for this was managing. Now, I go into a lot about deconstruction, and the thing is, she managed to deconstruct the hardcore third wave feminist position of biological essentialism. Now, I kind of retreat back into a form of metaphysical essentialism, but the biological essentialism is troublesome. I'll try not to say problematic. And the reason I say this is because now, quite early on in my book, I draw attention to the example of androgen insensitivity syndrome, which is an intersex condition, but it's of great importance in understanding my position about the grey areas, right? Yeah. So, androgen insensitivity syndrome is a condition that affects children who are born with a Y chromosome. So by the biological essentialists, anybody who has a Y chromosome is male. In fact, they even kind of go and say, oh, you're born a man. Well, you're not born a man, you're born a boy, and you grow up to be a man. But anyway, the point is that if you have androgen insensitivity syndrome, it's a rare genetic anomaly, which means that when in the early stages of being a fetus embryo, the child has a Y chromosome that triggers the development of testes. However, the next stage, which is the production of male hormone by the testes to virilize, masculinize the rest of the body, the male genitalia, it doesn't work because the body is insensitive. There's some chemical problem whereby the testosterone, their body can produce as much testosterone as you like. You can pump them into them. You could give them injections. It wouldn't make any difference at all. They would not, the body would not become, the child, the embryo would not become masculine in appearance. It would not develop male genitalia. And this is something that is usually not identified until at least the age of 15, because and some there was a sportswoman recently, she had a Spanish name, Martina Lopez or something, and she was actually, there's a very interesting case. I wasn't aware of this at the time that I wrote the book, but I've seen this elsewhere, that she didn't find out that she had androgen insensitivity syndrome until the age of about 25. Now, she had never had a period, but presumably the doctors had said, oh, it's just some kind of infertility problem. And she'd say, oh, fair enough. But in more recent times, you know, people are a bit more open about this. And obviously, it's very much about the reticence of the parents in telling the child when they find out, you know, when the child is perhaps examined at the age of 15 when she hasn't had periods. So the point I'm making about this is that you can have somebody who appears to all intents and purposes female. She grows up, she has a female gender identity, she sees herself as female, and yet she has a Y chromosome. And now, so the hardcore kind of gender conservatives, the TERFs, some would say, oh, well, that's just a man. That's just a man. Well, obviously, it's not a man.
Mm.
It's a woman, but she's not, but she's got a Y chromosome. So from a philosophical point of view, this takes apart the whole kind of rigid biological essentialism. And there are other even more obscure intersex anomalies that I go into in the book. The 5-alpha reductase anomaly is quite bizarre, and I think people will be interested to read about that, but I won't go into it now.
You mentioned a couple of conditions, and one of them is someone actually I know who is going through who's going through medical examination at the moment.
Oh yeah.
Now, he's a mature man. He's in his 40s. He's obviously male. He's homosexual. He has been for most of his life. But he had one of the conditions you mentioned. I can't remember which one it was.
It might have been Klinefelter's syndrome, perhaps.
It's something where he has gynecomastia. Like it's
yes,
like
I think it's
woman-like breasts on
yeah.
him.
Could be Klinefelter's syndrome. It's double XY.
He lacks muscle, the kind of masculine muscle tone. So he has a slightly feminized body. Whether this is connected to his homosexuality or not, I don't know. Because of course, men who don't have that condition also are sometimes gay. But he happens to be gay, and he thinks he has this condition. He's going through tests at the moment.
Yes, so I think it's quite likely. It does sound like it. It's probably Klinefelter's syndrome.
Yeah.
So you do have these intersex conditions. I mean, this is the point that, but nonetheless, society needs to be able to make these simple judgments, simple definitions.
And it's funny because I remember very well a story, because it's only in the last few years this has been a really big issue, because I remember reading long ago, I think I was a little kid, about a person from Brazil who was intersex. Now she considered herself a woman, yet she had a full set of both male and female genitals. She had both testes and ovaries. She had a penis. She had a vagina. God knows what that looked like. I don't know. I mean, I don't like to think about it. But she did have like a full set of genitalia, so she was a true hermaphrodite.
Yes.
Yet she still had a sexual identity. She still considered herself a woman, and she wanted to get married, even though she'd been registered as a boy. And she was going through a legal battle to get her official gender changed so she could marry her fiance, who was a man. Now, the thing about that is, obviously, this is an example of an intersex confusion over the law. But she had no doubt about her gender, and so really it wasn't half as complicated as probably if this sort of came up today. It would be deliberately, obstacles would be put in the way. New ingredients would be added into the broth to make it more complicated, things like that. So society has always had ways of dealing with intersexuality. It's always have had.
Yes, and also, I mean, transsexuals have existed. People who have had crude operations, for thousands of years in places like India, Thailand. There are well-established cultures that have existed, as I say, for thousands of years, of people who have done their best with the available techniques. And frankly, I'm just glad that competent urologists and anesthetics exist, so that I didn't have to go through that. But I mean, it shows how desperate some people can be. I mean, you'll have seen how the struggle I went through in my 20s, trying to face this anomaly within myself. So we obviously need to be able to do something about creating clear legal boundaries. Legal boundaries are very important for things. And I've started seeing people on social media saying, well, you should have separate sporting events, changing rooms, and so on and so forth, toilets for trans women, because they shouldn't be allowed to go into proper women's spaces. And well, they could just go with men. It's like, if I went into a men's changing room, I'd probably be at some kind of risk. Or, I mean, I could potentially be at some kind of risk. I mean, it's just inappropriate.
You couldn't do that, Claire. No, I mean, it's.
Oh.
I mean, like you mentioned, you're very obviously like a female person, and I mean, I didn't know you were trans when I met you, when I first saw you, and I can't think of you. I can't, like many other people in the book, I can't think of you really any other way, but because I didn't know you before you transitioned. I didn't know you, possibly, but you know, it's
about 35 years ago.
Yeah, you know, but it's you see, there's no, like I said, it's your case, as you describe in the book, and like many other trans people, really, there is a traditionalist kind of way of dealing with this, and you did deal with it your way, and I support anyone in your position as you were, with getting that whatever you need to fulfill yourself, and that once that's done, the complexities of which toilets you use really kind of goes away. There's no need for those complexities. I mean, the solution I originally had an idea of maybe having like say a third set of changing rooms or something like that. You know, that's kind of like the solution that doesn't seem so valid now I've read your book. But it's I think maybe we could go on to some of the darker issues of this.
Yes, by all means.
I mean, never. I always say to people, like, you may think to yourself, well, this kind of voodoo wouldn't work on me. It's not working on me, so it won't work on anyone. It won't affect my life because I can see through it. But you got to realize there's a lot of people more vulnerable than yourself. I'd say this to listeners and viewers who may be a lot older than some of the people affected. The people affected most by this may be a lot younger than you. People, teenagers, 20-somethings.
Oh yes, very much so.
It is clearly having a huge impact on their own sense of identity and self-esteem, and there's certain individuals, and I mentioned the people that Kevin Logan talks to. These are people who are a lot younger, and they're quite clearly very messed up individuals. And the thing about it is, this doesn't seem to be any brakes on this train. They're now talking about children. And you got a whole chapter on children. I felt very uncomfortable reading. But you mentioned, for example, you mentioned the Rima twins.
Oh,
that's a horrible case.
That is just, well,
that's got to be the worst case of child abuse I've ever heard of.
I've mentioned Dr. Milton Diamond, who has done more research on transsexualism than anybody else, and in the late 90s, before the identity of the Rima family was disclosed, it kind of came out in bits. So the full story wasn't known until about 2000 or 2001. But he wrote this paper called, which was entitled "The Rima Case: The Most Unethical Scientific Study in History."
That's got to be an understatement.
Yeah.
Well, for a bit of background, these were two twin boys. They both had circumcisions, like prophylactic circumcisions is often done in the United States. One of the boys suffered a terrible injury. I think suspiciously a terrible injury.
I think it's suspicious.
Yeah, such a bad injury to his penis that he was basically left dysfunctional.
Yeah.
He would never have a normal sex life with the injury that was done to him. Your penis it's a massive nerves and blood vessels and things like that. Even a minor injury could be debilitating, even life-threatening. And
particularly on a newly born child as well.
Yeah, this is why I am an intactivist when it comes to things like this myself.
Good. Yeah.
And the solution that Dr. John Money, who I'm sure must have some connection to MK Ultra, the solution he presented to the parents will just call him a girl instead. He's still a little baby. Just change his gender, call him a girl. And we'll give him treatment.
By that, it was something about 1961 or something, and so the gender reassignment on consenting adults obviously was a technique which had been established. So they just said, "Oh well, we'll just do it on this child, and the child will grow up as a girl. The child won't know any different." And but obviously.
Yeah. It's a long story that resulted in him dying at a young age by suicide. Indeed, his twin brother, who was uninjured, also took his own life. They're both dead now, and I suspect that this was some kind of obscene experiment. I don't think.
I think so. Yeah. Well, I don't go into it in as much detail as I could because there are other sources where you can really get under the bonnet on what happened with this. But there's a documentary that I saw in the early 2000s. And apparently Dr. Money, who never apologized, in the around about, say, late 60s and early 70s, was actually trying to indoctrinate the two children into the differences between boys and girls, and he would get them to stand naked, and he would point at David and say, that's what a girl is like, and he would point at the brother and say, that's what a boy is like. And this is like, what? This is like serious child abuse.
It's it's disgusting. I mean,
and he was
yeah.
I mean, he was and this actually affected me to some extent, because when I was a psychology student, this was one of the, and we covered neurodevelopment agenda, and unfortunately at the time Dr. Money's work was receiving quite a lot of currency and he was quite popular, so I basically bought into the fact that, well, I could just reprogram myself, you know. Yeah. I've just got some, you know, misapplied programming in my brain that I've picked up somewhere, I don't know how. And obviously, you know, this shows that you can indoctrinate someone to be one gender or the other, which of course is complete nonsense, because obviously his experience as he grew up, when he was a teenager, he began to think that there was something wrong, and eventually his mother confessed it to him. And it all made sense after that point.
Yeah, he never self-identifies as a girl. I mean, baby's not blank slates. And I noticed from my own daughter, the moment she was born, she had a personality, and she had a nature, some of which she still has today. And the babies you develop in utero before you're born, as you say. In utero is the term you use. I mean, you're of a similar generation, and you've been in a different circumstances. Luckily, you were in Central Africa at the time. You could have ended up being targeted by one of these horrible Tavistock Institute mind benders. So thank goodness you weren't. But it was, obviously, I mean, going back to the autobiographical side of your book, nobody put this idea in your head. I mean, you described through very young childhood you had. How did you feel when you were like a very, very young boy? How did you feel?
Well, up until that moment when I realized what the differences between boys and girls were when I was about 5, up to that point, I just have a few scattered images, mostly of Africa, just, you know, beautiful landscapes and colors and smells, and, you know, and realizing at that point when I was around about 5, realizing what the difference was between boys and girls, it was like a kind of it was like a moment of awakening, and I felt terribly. I knew instantly that this would not be something I could talk about to anybody. I just knew, you know, that you don't, you know, even at the age of 5, I just knew this is not, no, I better not say anything to anybody about this. And then there were various micro incidents throughout my childhood that I refer to, which would remind me of this. It never went away, but, you know, the other episodes would bring it to the surface. And then it wasn't until I was, I think, 17 or 16 or so. I think it was 17 when I wrote to the agony aunt, Claire Rayner.
I remember her, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, she was, well, I think it was beyond her ability to deal with, frankly, you know. But it was, I mean, it was just having somebody write back to me, you know, was in itself just, you know, something that gave me hope. Not, you know, there was never anybody trying to persuade me into having treatment or anything. It was far more the opposite.
Yeah, you chart this in great detail. I mean, I was quite disturbed that, I'm sure if I was your mum or mother or father, I'd have been alerted. You talk about an incident where you think you might have actually harmed yourself with a knife.
Yeah.
Your finger. I mean, this should be a red flag for a parent. And I suppose if you'd sort of been born today, I would hope we had some kind of environment where parents would be able to talk about that openly. So there is a positive side to transgender awareness, as well as this negative side that we've been discussing.
Yes.
But you went to a hell of a lot of effort, you described, to go through this. But what's interesting is I've got pages of notes here, and you had a very, very difficult time at puberty. Now, this to me is someone came up with a wonderful, it's not in your book, but somebody else came up with a wonderful way to describe it. They call it a bio-spiritual mutiny.
I like that. Yeah.
It's just good because essentially and this is what happens to me. Whenever I'm having some kind of emotional turmoil, it exhibits as a physical condition. Yeah. And it's actually even happening to me right now with a condition I have.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
That's thanks. Yeah. But you had terrible acne. I mean, all teenagers get acne, but you got it particularly badly.
It was really. I mean, very few people will have seen anything quite as bad as this. Really, all over my back as well. Huge boils. You know. And
you never really you described you never really fully completed puberty to your late 20s, which is
I guess
that indicates that should be that's basically the etheric side of your nature. Telling affecting your body, saying is all these feelings you had were causing this relationship from the etheric side of your body. I believe you have a spiritual side to yourself which directly influences the well-being of your body. Aruba Sheldrake talks about morphogenetic fields. You mentioned him in this book quite considerably.
Yeah,
he has a lot to say about DNA as well, which is equally relevant. But it's a harrowing story. I mean, you really got depressed at some periods of your life, didn't you? You got really, really down, and you were.
Well, particularly, I would say when I was about 15 was really a bad time because that's when my skin was at its worst, and then again in my mid-20s when I was really, really trying hard to just be a normal young man, and every time I'd get involved with a girl, it would kind of just go completely, badly, because I'd try and talk about my feelings and she'd freak out, and I can't blame her, So it was just torture, basically. It was just a torturous struggle to try and understand myself, to try and be normal. So that was why I took the diploma in art therapy to basically cure myself. That was the idea, but it came out with a different solution to what I had anticipated, in that I realized that this was something I could not change. I realized eventually that it must have been hardwired or something, because I just couldn't. It was with me every moment of every day, and it was just torture.
Yeah, and you do speculate on some of the processes, which of course as a child you would never be able to understand. But you talk about how babies before they're born can have I think you call it what's the word, in utero. I've got it in my notes, hang on. In utero, I've got I can't remember what the term is, it's somewhere in here. But basically it's something that even before you were born, nervous system fetal imprint you talk about. That's it.
Yeah.
And it could be that your nerves, even long before you were born, your nervous system grew a particular way.
Yes.
Which led you into this sort of, even though you were born with a male body.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that when the child is developing in utero, not everything develops at the same pace. So obviously the first thing that develops, in relation to this, is the gonads. So you either develop that is dependent on your DNA, your chromosomes, but then after that, it's like what I said about the androgen insensitivity syndrome. The body doesn't respond to the male hormone that's being produced by the testes, and similarly, as the body develops, with somebody like myself who might have some kind of androgen insensitivity problem, nonetheless I did develop externally as a boy. But the thing is that the brain structures associated with the kind of things that are related to gender identity develop at a later stage. So if the if their hormones are in any way interrupted at a later stage, then you can have the brain is simply just doesn't develop the full, masculine features that it would normally do so. And I mean, I don't go into this as much as I might, but obviously the book is quite long anyway. And some of these points I've been thinking about more since, we've got it through and published. I think there are 3 distinct characteristics of this neurodevelopment, which I think you probably need all 3 together to have a full-blown gender identity problem. And so these 3 characteristics are, first of all, there's the, I mentioned Professor Ramachandran's hypothesis that there is a, the body mapping is incomplete, so that there is a conflict between the body map, the inherent body map in the neurology of the motor nervous system and the external physical body. Then, so that's one which he managed to establish with the reference to subjects he spoke to about who had phantom limb phenomenon, or with female to male transsexuals. This is quite common. I've known 2 2 who they were lesbians, but they said that if they felt they could pass, they would have gone for it, because they had such severe phantom limb phenomenon. They felt like they had a man's body. It's quite remarkable.
It's just strange. People who lose a part of their body will sometimes still feel that it's there. Sometimes it even itches and you can't scratch it.
It's exactly
like that.
Right. Yeah. And so with someone like myself, it would be the other way around. That particular part of the brain would have failed to develop. So I have this kind of phantom absence, as it were. So that's one real kind of necessary defining characteristic, I would say, probably. The other ones are, there's a there would be the hypothalamus is related to sexual drive, who you find attractive. This is probably the least important, but if it goes with all the others, it would reinforce them. And then the third one would be there's a part of the brain structures called the striate nucleus, which is related to the amygdala, and you're probably familiar with the amygdala trigger concept. And I haven't seen any explanation as to why Gurin and Zhu in 2003, I think it was, found that the striate nucleus in transsexual women, this was like post-mortem studies, so obviously it's quite limited sample. But even with a limited sample, they did find a statistical difference in that the striate nucleus is smaller in transsexual women that have been post-mortemed. Now, what does this do? Well, I'm inclined to think that since it's related to the amygdala, it could be to do with attenuation of the fear response. Obviously, the amygdala is very much involved with fight or flight, or
like the adrenaline and the adrenaline effects and things like that.
Yeah. So men have a larger striate nucleus, I believe, which would indicate possibly, this is a hypothesis that can be tested. Basically, I don't have the experimental skills to do it, but I think in principle it is a hypothesis which could be tested, which is that I believe that a more highly developed striate nucleus would mean that it's more likely to have a stronger attenuation of fear. Well, obviously, I think in nature, I think you find that males have a stronger attenuation of fear.
Yeah. So
men fight, women flee.
It's a reduction in that particular response in a transsexual brain. Yeah.
That's right. So you would have a fight or flight fear response, which was more associated with the kind of response you would get with normal females than you would with men, because men have this natural, and this is partly possibly developed as a before birth, and possibly afterwards as well. So I think these things start off as factors in embryonic development, but they could possibly be affected by early childhood development, influences.
To me, it's an interesting field of study that maybe more work needs to be done on that.
Oh yes, no question about it. No.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of reluctance too, because of the political approach to this. When I was about 12 or 13 years ago, I was considering taking a master's in gender studies, but then I realized that they weren't interested in any of this stuff. They're just interested in, it's just like, well, social treatment of women is different in one country to what it is in another. Therefore, that's what we are here to study. Well, that's all very well, but it's only social, social cultures. That's all they deal with, and they don't deal with. They're obviously, the whole postmodern thing is very much about. How should I say? Basically, it's social. Everything is social. Everything is humans are a blank slate. You yourself said that children are not a blank slate. So if a newborn child isn't a blank slate, then obviously the gender studies idea that everything is merely acquired social constructs is not.
Yeah, I mean, they get into it. They call it essentialism, and they're opposed to it in all ways. I mean, even it goes into other areas such as the difference between men and women, the difference between people of different colours and races, people of different geographical backgrounds, and things like that. And it's extremely politically incorrect. But hopefully a time will come. Hopefully, your book and everything else will change that. I mean, at the risk of sounding ghoulish, I could recommend that when your incarnation on this world is over, you could donate your brain to medical science.
I have thought about that, Ben. I have thought about that, and I do consider.
Hopefully by then there will be a different intellectual environment, which.
Well, I would hope so. I mean, I had a friend, unfortunately, who passed away suddenly last year, and she made sure that she was cremated because she's worried about genetic experiments that might be carried out on, samples from your body, which is why she didn't ever want to go and, be tested on 23andMe or anything like that. So that's an interesting.
Well, to be honest, in this day and age, following the HeLa cell scandal and things like that, I can understand people being reticent. It's probably just the tip of the iceberg. But like I said, hopefully, it's speculating about a future world where hopefully there's people have calmed down a little bit, and there is a little more rationality involved in this, because what it would discover, this area of science, I think, would reveal that. Despite, in the contrary to what the people talk about with self-identification and all kinds of different genders and things like that, that people do have a fundamental gender identity. I mean, it's only in the last few years I've ever met anyone who says, I'm non-binary, call me it. Don't call me he or she, call me it. I mean, to me, this is unnatural. It is what you call an inanimate object. And non-binary. I mean, and even this person is complete total hermaphrodite with both sets, with four gonads, male, two male, two female, said I'm a woman. She still felt that she had a gender identity.
Yeah.
So why is it now suddenly we're being told, well, you don't, because this is where this blank slate idea inevitably goes. This cultural Marxist idea that we're all identical essentially, and we're built up from birth only to become something else. And we're all, apart from our reproductive functions, men and women are the same, and it's just not true, Claire. And it's and you and I understand this, but I think getting society to understand this, I would say it's difficult, but it's not that difficult once you get people thinking in this kind of outside this box. I think that's the key. I mean, the book, I think, will help hopefully people think outside that box.
I do hope so. And I mean, for instance, there's I don't know if I got a bit too kind of technical with some of the philosophical arguments and stuff that I got into, but I do pose this dilemma at the beginning of the book where I say, well, look, either men and women are the same, apart from the obvious physical differences, or else there are subtle but nonetheless real differences. And how can these differences in thought, behavior, and emotion, be different unless there are some biological or neurological differences within men and women? And I didn't refer to that. You probably remember that book from the 90s, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus.
Oh, I've not read it, but I've heard of it. It's quite a classic, isn't it?
It is. No, I haven't read it either myself, and I shied away from referring to it in the book because I've heard so many postmodernists kind of, try to take it apart and criticize it and so forth. And I thought, well, it's just not something I want to get into. I've got plenty of my own evidence. But I do think it's the case. I do think that there are, because we have the whole history of humanity, and the cultures, even though there are differences in cultures, they all share certain things,
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, there's a scene in What Is a Woman where Matt Walsh he visits some Maasai people. These are indigenous people from Kenya.
Oh, I've heard about this. Yeah, go on.
It's a very amusing scene because he asks these questions like, "What is a woman? Can a man be a woman? Can a woman be a man?" And these people who lived have a completely different culture from us. They just look at him in a frown in bemusement and say, "It's obvious." They say, of course, we know what a woman is, and they point this is a woman, this is a man, things like that. It's very obvious. And of course, a postmodern interpretation would be that these people are backward transphobes. Yes. Which is ironic because they're not white, but
yes, that's obviously
that'll probably hold them back a bit. But the truth of the matter is, this is a culture that is thousands of years old, and they will have had intersex people within their culture. They will. It's these anomalies, like Down syndrome. It's something that's not. It's not a sort of like congenital hereditary disease.
Yes,
it's something that's an inevitable part of human development. So they will have had intersex people in their culture, and presumably, they would have found some way to deal with those people, and those people would have found some way to fit in with their society, and they would have done it in a much more organic way than is currently being suggested. And you see, and if you'd had that, if I say maybe we can have some kind of culture where true transgender people who had this experience you had from the very earliest age. Believing, I am literally just I shouldn't be a man, I shouldn't be a boy. They can actually be helped in the way that you were, maybe rather than being, as you said, you chart your life through your youth, trying your best to go against this, experience this horrible puberty and things like this. And then maybe you could have been in such an environment, if you've been born today as you are, you'd have been in a better position, and this wouldn't be being programmed in me saying I've got a transgender child and things like that.
It really frightens me because you see these aren't there several Hollywood movie stars who have got trans children?
Yes.
And
oh god, Charlize Theron. Oh my god, that woman needs to be locked up. She's a South African actress. She's adopted a young black boy, and he wears a dress, and he has his hair in a female style, and he looks is miserable as sin.
Yeah, and doesn't the Tomb Raider actress
Angelina Jolie.
Doesn't she have a trans child as well?
I wouldn't surprise you, because she was the one who got the BRCA gene patented when she supposedly had a double mastectomy, because so she's always been in there with Big Pharma. That's a long. I won't go into that now.
No, that's just the whole.
Yeah, we'll have to finish within about a quarter of an hour anyway.
Yeah,
but
no, that's fine, Ben. Thank you. Yes.
No, but these people, because they're famous, maybe. I mean, we all know about Will Smith. Now, Will Smith is infamous because of this slap, which is probably staged. It's probably staged event with Chris Rock.
The slap.
Yeah. The slap, which is probably staged just to get more people watching, like the Brit Awards used to do. Something would always go wrong. Do you remember the Brit Awards?
Oh.
It was either Jimmy Corty shooting the audience, or a water fight started by Chumbawamba, or something like that, But The fact is, he and his wife obviously have a rather, to me, looks like a very dysfunctional relationship, and she's ill. Obviously, she's lost her hair. But their son, Jaden Smith, is supposedly he's what's the word? A non-binary global pioneer. He's the one. Jaden Smith he's only about 21. He is a screwed up young man.
I don't really know much about this, I'm afraid, Ben.
Okay. Basically, he's non-binary, and sometimes he wears male style clothing. Sometimes he wears. I mean, to me, he's a boy. I mean, he sometimes wears female style clothing and with fashions of women, and sometimes men. And I think to myself, that's just. And he, of course, is famous because he's got
Will
these.
Smith.
Yeah, Will Smith's his dad, and Jaden's. She's an actress as well, and maybe. I mean, these Hollywood people, people envy them, but I wouldn't swap places with them. I would never want to live their life.
I'm nervous enough about the, focus that's going to be on me for this book, but at least I can keep the world at some kind of distance with this. It's not I mean, I may be doing a few podcasts and interviews and stuff, but I'm not. It just freaks me out to think about these celebrity gatherings, I've actually had 2 calls from New York since my book came out. I don't know how they got my phone number. I'm sure Arctos didn't give it to them. And they're these people from big corporations in New York have said, we've noticed your book and I'm sure you'd like to do this, that and the other. And they were wanted to do a interview with me that they were going to charge me $2,000 for. And what?
They want you to pay for the interview.
Yeah, I know. Well, because they say we'd put it into high production video and it would promote your book and everything like this. And this woman spent 3/4 of an hour talking to me before she mentioned that it would be charging me $2,000. I mean, it's and then somebody else left me a voicemail. And I looked them up on the internet, and they are a real person at a real corporation, but this real person at this real corporation wants me to do a distribution deal with them. And I'm thinking, why would I want to do a distribution deal when I've got a publisher? I mean,
exactly. That's their job.
That's
job.
And I know that the guys at Arctos are very heavily overloaded, and it's probably going to be a bit of a slow climb to get this, known about. But I would much rather do it organically than get into bed with, I mean, my immediate response to these things was that they were kind of fishing expeditions they're probably wanting to do a hit piece on me because basically it's controversy.
Yeah, well, from what you've described, I mean, it's just quite alarming news you've just given me. It could even be some kind of recruitment attempt by whatever intelligence, psychological warfare agenda is behind all this agency. I mean, you bring up a couple of times in the book, you speculate, and you're quite right to. I think it's that's where all the arrows are pointing. I think that this is some kind of psyop. The whole thing. I mean, you talk about how. I mean, this goes back to the beginning of first wave feminism, even with the Fabian Society and things like that. But more recently, we've had the Frankfurt School, the Tavistock Institute. And I actually knew one of the founders of the Tavistock Institute. She was she was actually kind of my step grandmother. And I'll tell you, she was a monstrous person. Yeah. She was truly vicious. I won't go into that in detail now, but she's quite. She made me feel like all the time I felt like I was being tied up and controlled all the time I was in her.
Well, that's very indicative, I think. I mean, I have to be careful about what I say about these things. But it does seem to me that, for instance, using objective evidence like the whatever it was, 1,000% increase in referrals for teenage girls for gender reassignment.
You did. It's absolutely. You've got the statistics in the book, and it's absolutely shot up enormously.
Yeah, all in the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's literally very, very recent, and it's astonishingly recent. Literally, this whole woke stuff has really only come about in the last few years, and it's been rushed through. I mean, it's almost. I feel like the powers that shouldn't be are almost they're in a bit of a rush to get it through as quickly as possible.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
We talked about this when we brought up Brexit and Trump, and about how it seems like they're sprinting for the finish line really quickly now, as if they feel they're up against a shrinking period of time.
Well, I mean, you've obviously mentioned, what you call the 2016 effect, and there's no doubt in my mind that was definitely not on the agenda, and I know people have their different opinions about Donald Trump, but I was watching the Dark Journalist interview with Millie Weaver.
Oh, was that about Trump's uncle?
Well, no, it was just Millie Weaver, who I don't know if she still works for InfoWars and Alex Jones, but she was, and there was all sorts of things. I can't possibly go into the detail about it, but anyway, one of the things she was pointing out was that, because we do get these people, who are the kind of people I'm talking about, who say things like, oh, Trump is just one of them, he's all controlled opposition and anything like that. Well, the fact is that I don't think they would have gone to the lengths they have to tarnish Donald Trump if he was really playing on their side and just, just play acting.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, as we were saying earlier, there's a kind of a sense of almost internecine paranoia within the truth movement, and some of them, it's basically everything that happens is what the bad guys want to happen, which is not true.
That's right.
They don't have magical powers. They have they practice black magic, but they're not basically they are bound by the laws of economics and physics and everything else like the rest of us.
Yeah.
And they are in trouble. Styx Hexenhammer did a video about that the other day, which is quite good.
Oh, I haven't been watching him lately. What did he say? I can't remember
what it's called. He was saying basically that he senses that there's a very deep fear within the globalist agenda right now, a very, very deep sense of insecurity that their tricks are not going to work in the long term on a strategic level.
I mean,
everything else they've done has backfired on them, isn't it?
Well, exactly.
Yeah, monkeypox, which is they're now changing the name because we've come up with too many amusing memes.
A monkeypox on their houses.
Yeah, and this will go the same way, Claire. I think this at some point reason is going to prevail, and when reason prevails, it can sometimes be literally the case of it's darkest before the dawn. It's like in the book and the film and the story, the War of the Worlds. Niall Murphy brought this up on his podcast Through an Opaque Lens.
Oh, yeah.
It's not a bad story, but there is a kind of a bit of a Deus Ex Machina at the end of it. It's just when you think the aliens are going to win, they all die of Earth diseases.
Yes. COVID is our friend.
Yeah, exactly. They all die of the coof. This was 120 years ago. This book was written,
of course.
But it's an example of, like, I know it's not very satisfying in fiction, but it's much more like real life, because in real life things like that sometimes do happen. The Soviet Union seemed enormously powerful almost up to the minute that it collapsed. I mean, they were reforming it like mad under Gorbachev.
Yeah.
And when the collapse began in I think 1989 with East Germany, the war coming down in East Germany, literally it was less than 2 years before this total collapse happened. It was mostly peaceful, with exceptions like Romania. Of course, Yugoslavia is another story. That was horrible. But generally, Yugoslavia was independent from the Third International anyway. But the whole Soviet system collapsed quite cleanly and smoothly, almost as if it was what followed happened quite almost effortlessly. It was almost like a baby whose head was engaged coming out. It's like a quick birth. And so everything, as we've seen with the COVID situation, which I've no doubt there was an emergency stop on this. They just panicked and they pressed the red button and said stop it now, because that's why it went away so quickly.
Oh, well, it's remarkable, isn't it? And then of course it was immediately replaced.
Yeah, you've seen the meme, haven't you? You've shared it with the meme with the distracted girlfriend meme. The distracted boyfriend meme, where the boyfriend has a sheep's head, and the girlfriend is the coronavirus, and the distraction is the Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's literally almost it's literally a war where Orwellian Eurasia and East Asia situation, where one moment we're at war with one, then we're at war with the other, and they're hoping people won't notice. Now, when they do that, of course, within the 1984 scenario, this is an essential part of the Big Brother state. However, when this happens in real life, it's because they're frightened, and they've suddenly dropped a fundamental strategy that they've been working on for several years, and they've said it's not working. Get rid of it now. We're going to try something else.
Yes. Yeah,
and indeed they are trying other things. They're trying food shortages. There's probably going to be petrol shortages and things. And this is a part of it. This mind manipulation based around the trans issue is a part of that.
Yeah, there's no question about it in my mind. Obviously, these things all started. We historically these things were often separate threads, but they've all been kind of drawn in towards the just the mind mess, that they're trying to get everybody just to. It's really. I think one of the things about what is they're trying to see how far they can take it, because, for instance, people like myself, up until about the late 2000s, people were generally pretty accepting. I think, obviously, it was a difficult kind of movement, but in time, people found out that there were people, there was, apparently only a few thousand of us wanting to, have medically reassigned gender recognition certificates, and then I think people had kind of come round to that, because it's like, well, nobody's trying to change society, nobody's trying to do anything, they just want to fit in and be themselves. And then
use the word stealth, which is
it's how we had to be.
That.
Yeah, but the point is, if you could be stealth and then you go through that for 10, 15, 20 years, it gets to the point where you're just virtually accepted by default. But then suddenly you start getting, in the last 10, 12, 15 years or whatever, since about 2012 or so, we've had this whole transgender thing, as opposed to transsexuals, whereby where, as we talked earlier, people who haven't had any of these treatments or don't even change the way they socially present are now claiming, that they go to women's prisons and rape women there because they're still male-bodied. And I can't help but feel that this is kind of being ramped up because they're kind of getting behind schedule, as it were.
Yes.
And they just have to push it, and they have to push all these different silly agendas. I mean, sorry, I'm just absolutely still, even after several years of this, I'm completely mind-boggled at the way that they expect people to accept. We spent 50, 60, 70, 80 years reaching the point where people who had full medical reassignment could be recognised in their acquired gender. Great. So the moment that's got through the door, suddenly they want to turn the whole thing upside down and make it such that, well, actually, we went to all this trouble to define how someone could be recognised in the opposite gender, but now we're just going to throw all that out. And you don't need to have medical treatment. You don't need to even look like a woman. You don't need to behave like a woman. You don't need to do anything about it. You can just simply claim it. Yeah. And obviously that is, that's just going beyond what most people are willing to accept. And so then, of course, there's the pushback, which affects people like me, who've been quietly getting on with our lives for the last, 30 odd years. And it's suddenly like, oh, we're going to force you to change back. I don't know how they would do that.
Oh, it's really tragic, because you've been kind of caught in the crossfire with this. I don't think people. I think people like Posey Parker and the TERFs. I don't think you're the really. I mean, I know one of them sort of misidentified you and called you Widow Twanky and things like this, which is pretty cruel. I don't. But it seems like they're trying to. They've now got to the point where it's like Sargon, unfortunately, has gone on this path as well. Where now all trans people are being tarred with the same brush by the backlash, and you've been caught in the crossfire with this. Even though you have less in common. You have less in common with these trans trenders and the celebrity trans kids and people like that. You have less in common with them than I do.
Yes.
It's really so. Because this is why you punch both left and right here. You do expose the nonsense of the backlash, but really the backlash essentially is an antithesis of this whole nonsense in the first place. the whole rubbish that came out originally. And it is not. I don't think it's accidental, Claire. It's not accidental.
No. I do think there's a lot of what you might call useful idiots. People who are doing it because they think that it is politically correct to do this. I'm sure that this is. I see a lot of the young people who go into do gender studies. It's just a fashion, it's just the current trendy thing in the current year, and they think that they're being, tremendously, righteous and virtue signaling to do these things, but actually they haven't really. I mean, when it gets to the point where I am demonized, I mean, I've been cancelled by the Headingley Literature Festival some years ago. I was going to give a preview of my book. I was cancelled. Then more recently, the venue itself cancelled me because they didn't like something I said in one of my interviews about 7 years ago. So I'm quite used to this kind of thing, by now. It's indicative of the fact that these people really, they've only done this because people complain to them. People draw attention, the people who are the organizers, the administrators of these things like the, art center and stuff. They have people, one person or two people will write letters to them saying, Claire is a transphobe, or you've got to stop her speaking, and they don't know anything about me, and then they make false claims about me, and everybody is just so terrified of being called a transphobe or some other, epithet that it's just simpler for them to say, no, we won't go there.
Yeah, this unfortunately is a common reaction that people are very, very unwilling to resist when you get these nasty letters from certain people about certain issues.
Yeah,
and I'd like to see them I'd like to see people like venues and people like that, and publishers and producers and people like that show a bit of balls, literally or figuratively, and stand up to these damn people and say, no, we're not going to do it. We believe in free speech. We are a media organization, and we're going to allow people to hear this speaker. And of course, then you might get some protesters and things like that. But at the same time, you've got to stand up, like when when Andy No's book was, or No, whatever he's called, was kicked out.
Oh yes.
Was taken off a bookshelf. They had a few people turned up and shouted some nasty things, and the book, get rid of the book. Get rid of the book.
I know. No.
It's easier and quicker to do that, but it's in the long run, it's cowardly, and it is very destructive if you give in to these people. Really
and that's why I'm so grateful, and I'm so glad that you've been willing to, take me on and let me, say what I have to say, Ben. And I mean, obviously, you knew roughly the kind of position I was taking before you read the book, because we've been friends for some years now, and I've talked about this before, and I'm very grateful, for that. And also I'm extremely grateful for Arctos, because really they are sticking their neck out a bit on this one. In fact, as Alexander himself said when I was talking to him, he said, well, this is going to be something which is not only challenging to the general population, but actually to the readership and listenership of Arctos,
Yeah. Again, as you explained, there's people on the right in the distant circles that need to be educated too.
Absolutely, and I hope they'll be more reasonable than the left, because
they will be. They will be.
I think so.
I think I think it's that audience will probably get the most out of this book. However,
I hope so.
Yeah, hopefully it will change the minds of other people, like probably people who consider themselves left wing and consider themselves like. Hopefully it will.
Well,
but yeah.
I hopefully the fact that I'm coming from a position of life experience, I'm putting my whole life out there, on this. Well, maybe not all of it, but a substantial part of it. And I think this is one of the reasons why people will hopefully be reluctant to be too hostile, because I've got my credentials. I've paid my dues, as they used to say.
Exactly. I mean, you are yourself a trans person, and you're speaking. Like I say, it's not like no one can say, "Oh, but if you were trans, you'd understand," and things like that, because you do.
And I've had, I've had the good fortune to have studied this as far back as the 1970s at university, and I happen to have been coincidentally in lots of the right places at the right times over the last 30 or 40 years to see, people. I mean, it's just kind of, it's interesting to me, for instance, that Professor Whittle, who I started out with being a very, very close friend with, 48 years ago or something, is now kind of somebody who I have to take a position against.
When you're gonna do that sometimes, yeah.
Yeah,
I found that myself.
It's very sad.
Yeah, but anyway, Claire, unfortunately, we're gonna have to leave it there.
Okay.
The book itself is available now. It's published by Arctos, and it is on Amazon at the moment. At the time we're recording this, it is available on Amazon. However, by the time you hear this, it may very well not be. If so, I mean, it is available. Luckily, Arctos have a lot of experience in dealing with banned books.
Yes.
So if you go to arctos.com, it's ARKTOS.com, you will find instructions about how you can purchase the book, even if it is cancelled and banned. But
I do hope that it will stay on Amazon for a while at least. Cool. And please, if anybody, I hope you'll write, now that we've done the interview, Ben, I do hope you'll write me a review.
I will write a review, definitely. I've got
fantastic.
I've got a lot of notes here. I'll write you a review, and please do pick up the book wherever you can. It is currently on Amazon. That's where I got it from. And Claire, I mean, I've got so many notes here. I'd like to do another interview with you at some point.
I'd be very happy to, Ben.
No, thanks very much. You go on to so many other areas, such as the feminism issue, and of course the metaphysical side of things and the spiritual side of things as well. You have you go into the waking the monkey sort of issues, which I'd love to talk to you about. So maybe in a few weeks we could come back to this.
I'd be very happy to, Ben. I mean, obviously, there was so much more I could have put in. But obviously at 370 pages with 5 appendices, 2 or 3 of which were quite long, but I think helpful. Obviously, I think it was just getting to the point where I just couldn't put any more material in, Yeah,
you have to draw the line, because you could talk about this forever, really. But you have to put a line under it at some point. I know.
Absolutely. There's plenty. I look back on it now, and I think there's lots of little details in my own experience that I missed out. Lots of some of the you see, I haven't updated some of the material that's come out in the last 2 or 3 years since I completed the manuscript. There's just so much, but it's fantastic to be able to get it out, speak to people like yourself, and put the word around that there is a rational voice of sense on the trans issue out there.
We really need that right now.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Yeah, Claire Rae Randall, it's great to talk to you. Talk to you again soon. Thanks for being a guest on the Hapanwo Show on Hapanwo Radio.
Thank you very much, Ben, for having me on your show. Thanks a lot.
And I hope you found that interesting, Hapanwo TV viewers. I certainly found it interesting talking to Claire. And what's more, I've already made some plans with her to do some more recordings in the future, so we'll be doing some more interviews about different subjects. This is actually not the first time I've interviewed Claire per se. This is the first time I've interviewed her on Hapanwo TV. But if you go to Hapanwo Radio, you'll find many other interviews with her on all kinds of different subjects. We cover like the Trump phenomenon and Brexit and spiritual matters and things like that, and Claire deals with all these sorts of issues. She's a very intelligent lady. She's well read. She talks about C.S. Lewis and things like that, and religion and atheism and stuff like that. She could give Richard Dawkins a run for her money. My goodness me, wouldn't that be a wonderful debate? So expect to hear more from Claire pretty soon on this channel, and indeed, as always, check out her links. Now you can go to. I deliberately put a link to the publisher's page on this in the actual description box of this video, and not like just Amazon or something. And the reason is Amazon could literally ban it at any moment. So I put a link to the publisher's page, which has the subsequent links to all the retailers where it's on sale. Now, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that going down, because Arctos actually are very experienced in dealing with books that regularly get banned from Amazon and other mainstream platforms. So if you go to the publisher's page, it's probably the best way of knowing where you can actually buy that book. this book at the exact moment and where it is. So check it out. It's in paperback right now. I think it's on Kindle as well. But you know me, I prefer a good old paperback myself. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you find that interesting. And well, there's more videos coming soon. I did promise you a live stream about cryonics. I've got to get this out of the way. I've been putting it off for so long. It's just other things keep getting in the way, don't they? Oh. So I'm going to do the cryonics live stream as soon as I can before something else happens in the world of ufology or something else, which then forces me to postpone it yet again. Alright guys, see you again soon. Take care. Thank you all for watching Hapanwo TV. Hospital Porters, Pride and Dignity. Stop the New World Order.